like minds come together. Recording in progress. Very good. And so you said Dr. Rick is an okay introduction, and interesting that you've had sort of 4 different jobs with 2 different companies in your career since becoming a PhD in meteorology. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, the way I like to explain it is every job I've had has been so nice I've had it twice because I've lived in Hawaii 2 different times to go to do a postdoc and work at the Weather Service Honolulu at Central Pacific Hurricane Center. I've done the Hurricane Center twice as a forecaster and then later as director, and now I'm on my second tenure at the Weather Channel. So I've a lot of moving around, but it's been a lot of moving around, but it's been just different positions on the same field, is the way I like to put it.
Wow. So that must give you a kind of an advantage to being able to study the cyclones in the Pacific and the Atlantic and be able to stitch it all together. And maybe a word about before we begin, I'm going to just let you go. And then once we go, I'll do the screen share and you go through your slides. But uh, the La Nina seems to be the big elephant in the room that changes this season compared to the last few seasons.
Yeah, no doubt about it. The departure of El Nino this year is going to make it for a very different Atlantic hurricane season this year. Last year was that epic battle between El Nino that was really strong and the record warm Atlantic. Well, the El Nino is going away, but the Atlantic is even warmer than last year. So I think the Caribbean freight train of hurricanes could turn back on. And again, as we'll talk about, we know it's going to be busy this year. We just don't know how bad it's going to be. That depends on where the storms go. But I think we will have, unfortunately, more chances at it this year.
Have you done much hurricane forecasting, or I mean, long range, or mostly just kind of in situ?
No, my focus has been on the 5 to 7 day forecast time horizon. But here at the Weather Channel, especially, but even in my time at the Hurricane Center, spent a lot of time understanding the state of the science with seasonal forecasting and focusing on what we can and cannot glean from the seasonal forecast. So it's been something I've thought a lot about.
Yeah. Phil Klutzbach actually grew up here in Eastern Massachusetts, a New Englander
Mm-hmm.
now at CSU, taking William Gray's position, if anyone could do
Right.
that. So it's great that we've had now experience over the decades and of doing this. So once again, this is Tim Kelley. I'm in Weymouth, Massachusetts. That's the Fall River looking over towards the Boston Harbor here. And you are in the Weather Channel, Dr. Rick?
Yeah, I'm at the Weather Channel studios. You'd think, well, why can't you go into one of the studios and do this from there? But all those studios are in use either for live television or for recorded segments that are being worked on. But I will be on the air at 1 p.m. Eastern time on Weather Unfiltered with Alex Wilson.
Oh, great. So we can tune in after this. We can see you on the air doing the live.
Yep.
I want a selfie with us. That's funny. All right, great. So it's 10:37 and I guess we can get started. We've been doing the warm-ups here and we've got the guests continuing to sign in. So if you give the word, I'll try and just follow along with you. And I guess I have to do a screen share, which I've practiced. I can do this. I think it's already there. Let's see what happens. And Cheryl, you can tell me if I'm doing this right or wrong. What do we see now? Does everyone see
your face?
My face? All
Mhm.
right. Let's work on that. I don't want to see my face.
Are you sharing a slide?
I have it up, so I've just got to go back to screen
Okay.
share. And share. One panelist. Multiple panelists can one panelist can share screen at a time. Very good. And how do I do that? Share green. Oh, I think I'm doing it. I think I'm doing it. Am I?
No,
No, not yet.
not yet.
What?
When you hit screen share, there you go.
Is it there?
Yes, good job.
Okay, and so I can see the screen, and is it big enough? Cheryl, does it look good?
It looks fantastic. These are Dr. Knabb's slides, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and
Okay.
this is the very last slide, so we can go back to the very beginning. And but
Everybody
this is where
close
I'm
your
headed.
eyes. Close
No,
your
no,
eyes.
it's okay. That's where I'm headed with all this. There we go.
How we look, Cheryl? Is this good?
Fantastic, in my opinion.
All right. Dr. Rick, it's yours.
Okay, thanks everybody. So you see the title there. I'm going to talk about how we can all communicate with the public and amongst ourselves, actually, about preparing for and recovering from hurricanes. And it's not just going to be about, tangible things that people can be doing to get ready for the next hurricane, and that is really important to do starting now or even earlier than now. But I'm also going to talk about not only how we should behave so that we have the advantage over the hurricane that might come our way, but we'll talk about how hurricanes themselves are behaving, how we expect them to behave this year, and how they have been behaving. Are things going out of bounds? How are things changing? And a lot of topics that have been out there for discussion recently that you might be interested in having a talk about. And I'll give you some perspectives based on what we've been talking about on the air. I'm going to show you a lot of the on-air graphics that we've been using to discuss these topics over the last couple of years, and then we will leave time for Q&A. So let's go to the first slide here. And the first topic you might have heard about over the last few weeks and months is this idea of a Category 6 hurricane. And this was a research paper that was put out a couple months ago. The stated purpose of the paper was to draw attention to the fact that our changing climate is changing the behavior of hurricanes. But they also did a very good job of getting a lot of attention on the paper by provocatively raising the question, implicitly or explicitly, about whether or not 5 categories on the hurricane scale capture what is going on. And so what I did when I talked about this on the air was I just laid it out. Let's talk about a Category 6 if there were to be one. What are the pros and cons of doing that? And we can go back one to summarize the pros of a Category 6. Yeah.
Excuse me. Pros of a Category 6.
Yeah. One thing it does do, and this is what that research paper that was published makes the point about, is that it emphasizes that hurricanes are peaking out a bit stronger than they used to. And that is true. They are, but how much stronger? Now, in my mind, about 9 years ago, Hurricane Patricia in the Eastern Pacific, just on the other side of Mexico, was a big alarm bell about just how strong hurricanes are capable of getting. And, Patricia went way, way above the Category 5 threshold. And we only know that because hurricane hunters were in there because it was a land threat to Mexico. And so if we were to have a lot more Patricias going forward, then we probably would need another category, or there'd be a good argument to have one. If hurricanes were to start getting a lot stronger routinely, then that would help convey the fact that, especially from wind, but other hazards as well, a storm that's way above the Category 5 threshold can cause a lot more damage when it comes to wind. And if you were to say that a current hurricane is a category higher than any category we've had before, then you put more attention on that hurricane and the overall issue of the strength of hurricanes. However, there are other things to consider, and we'll go to the next slide. And one thing that I'll make a point about is that this is not a problem yet that really needs solving, especially not in the Atlantic Basin. You see where Patricia was with max sustained winds about 215 miles an hour, but in that hypothetical Category 6 threshold around 190 or 195 miles an hour, we just don't have any hurricanes in the Atlantic that have been over 190. It hasn't happened yet. So I don't think it's a problem yet. And if we were to start seeing more Atlantic hurricanes, especially for our part of the world, to get higher than 190, then it might be worth discussing. But not until then, I don't think should we do it, because as I'll show you on the next slide, there are a lot of negatives to the possibility of another category. Number one, if we add another category now in the Atlantic Basin, it'd be for no reason, at least up to now, because they're just too rare, haven't even occurred in the Atlantic. And there could be a lot of things that a new category could do to cause more confusion. For one, would we then be telling people that they should respond and react and prepare differently for a category 6 than a category 5? You know, in many respects, the category 5 is already catastrophic enough. And if it was a 6 in a forecast sense, we should already be preparing just the same way. But here's the other big issue, is that it could add to confusion during comparatively weaker storms. You know, we already have enough trouble with 5 categories, convincing people that category 1s and 2s and 3s can be catastrophic in some situations. And you add a category 6, well, then what's going to happen? Are people going to go, well, it's only a 3 or a 4, I'm not worried about it, this is no 6, you know? So that would, yeah, we'd want to add this new category for a good reason. And I don't think we have very many good reasons to do it yet. And here are some past examples. Let's go to the next slide, just to show you what specific problems we've had with the categories and what a 6th category would add to. We've been trying over the last several years, including when I was director of the Hurricane Center, and still we're pushing for this on many fronts. We're trying to get the focus away from the storms category and focus on hazard-specific, location-specific information. So we're trying to de-emphasize categories in general, not add more attention to them, because categories don't explain all the hazards. Because what we all care about is what wind and water could happen where we live. You know, what the storms category and status is of secondary importance to what could happen where we live. And, you know, this has reinvigorated the debate about, well, can't we come up with a better scale? But we debated that for decades at the Hurricane Center, and the answer hasn't changed. I don't think anybody could come up with a better scale, because no single scale can responsibly convey all the wind and water hazards, because what wind and what water you get has to do with a lot more than just the wind strength of the hurricane, which is what these categories are based on. And so if the goal of all this is to highlight the fact that the changing climate is causing hurricanes to peak out a little stronger, which is definitely happening, I don't think that's enough reason to use a new category, because there are so many negatives. And the next slide, let's go to some specific storms that highlight this issue. And 2018 is the best example of this when you look at Florence and Michael. Michael, of course, is the October category 5 that hit the Florida Panhandle. Florence was a major hurricane, long-lived over the Atlantic in September, that came ashore after weakening from a major hurricane and was a slow-moving category 1 hurricane when it came ashore. Both of these hurricanes, damage cost was on the order of $25 billion. One was a category 5, the other was a category 1, and they were equally catastrophic. Next slide to highlight Florence, along with a number of other category 1 hurricanes. And look at Irene, you all will remember, in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Was a tropical storm when it produced the flooding disaster in Vermont and surrounding areas. Agnes in 1972 was a hurricane when it came ashore in the zone that Michael did, and then as a much weaker system caused that deadly flooding event in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast in 1972. Sandy was the equivalent wind strength to a category 1, but it was huge and hit a large population center with devastating consequences. Matthew, 2016, when it actually made landfall in the continental US, it was no longer a major hurricane. So there are a lot of past examples where we don't want to emphasize the category so much, because you can imagine with the approach of Michael in the Eastern Gulf of Mexico, as it's ramping up, well, it's a 3, now it's a 4, now it's a 5. The categorization system was helpful on the upswing with Michael rapidly intensifying before the coastline. However, after Florence peaked in intensity and is moving toward the southeast mid-Atlantic coast and it's weakening, we struggled mightily to keep people alert and preparing, because there was a bit of a letdown in preparedness and concern because it was no longer a major hurricane and because people thought it was only a Category 1 hurricane. But Florence had these other characteristics: large, very slow moving, essentially stalling. And it was a storm surge and especially rainfall induced flood disaster. So especially for water, these weaker storms can be just as damaging, just as deadly. So yet another reason not to hang our hats completely on what the wind strength category is. However, when we're talking about hurricanes on the upswing and rapidly intensifying to make landfall, this is where the wind category is helpful. And we've had plenty of experience with, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, with hurricanes rapidly intensifying to Category 4 or 5 at landfall, including a number of cases in recent years: Harvey in 2017, Michael in 18, Laura in 2020, Ida in 21, Ian 22. It goes on and on. It's been a very busy last decade for these events. And I think the data show and the eyeball test shows that hurricanes are peaking out a little bit stronger than they used to, and they're getting there a little bit faster than they used to. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen the forecasts of rapid intensification get a little more accurate. Well, because it's happening more often. You know, if it hardly ever happened, it'd be even harder to pick out the timing and intensity of a rapid intensification event than it already is. However, we should tip our hat to the forecasters at the Hurricane Center and to the numerical modeling community. We've gotten a lot better, you know, on many fronts at anticipating rapid intensification. I remember with Laura in 2020 and Ian in 2022, when the systems were much weaker in the Caribbean Sea, we had a pretty good idea these were going to be major hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. And the other thing about, of course, rapid intensification in a lot of these events is it all happens within 2-3 days in many cases. You go from tropical storm in the Northwest Caribbean to a landfalling Cat 4 or 5 that rapidly intensified, all in far less than 5 days. So we don't always have 5 days to get ready on our emergency management timelines and our personal timelines. And not just the 4s and the 5s, but we've had a number, in the last quarter century of hurricanes ramping up until landfall, including like Zeta in 2020 that went right over New Orleans, and the likes of Sally and Isaac, even though they weren't major hurricanes at landfall. So the Gulf of Mexico is a ripe zone for intensification up to the time of landfall. So it's so important in forecasting and communicating in these situations to not focus, as social scientists have told us that people often do. If people tend to focus on what is the current intensity, but we've got to be preparing for what the forecast intensity is, what it's forecast to be, not what it is now. It's a human nature for people to wait until it's actually a 4 or a 5 to be worried about it. Whereas if it's a tropical storm or a Cat 1 and we're forecasting it to be a 3 or a 4, there's a little more hesitancy to prepare as much. But the intensity forecasts are actually starting to get better. Back in the day, not even that long ago, a decade ago, every time we talked about forecast accuracy, we'd talk about how track forecasts are getting better, intensity forecasts not so much. But we're starting to crack that nut. Intensity forecast accuracy is improving, and we're even able to somewhat anticipate rapid intensification a little better than we used to. Not all the time. Hurricane Otto in the East Pacific last year, going to Acapulco, is an example where we did not capture it. And Idalia is the latest example of an intensifying major hurricane at landfall in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. The only reason this isn't getting as much attention as the likes of Ian or Michael and others is hit a lower population area that thankfully a lot of the structures in this area were actually built up to handle the storm surge. But this was an example where Clearwater Beach in the Tampa Bay area got a few feet of storm surge, water got into people's homes. So it was a wake-up call for places like Tampa that you don't have to have a landfall near you to get very significant impacts. Okay, next slide. So on that topic, let's talk about some areas that you would think are really hurricane savvy and they've been through this before and they're as ready as they can ever be. But we have a lot of areas in our country, a lot of metro areas that have been dodging it for a long, long time. And despite the Clearwater Beach impacts from Idalia last year and some other close calls, Tampa Bay area hasn't been directly struck by a major hurricane in over a century. And at some point that good fortune is going to run out. Obviously Charlie and Ian were close calls in the sense that Tampa Bay was one of the areas at risk before landfall occurred. With other systems in the northeastern Gulf, Labor Day hurricane of 35, these all threatened the Tampa Bay area, but nothing was as direct as the 1921 hurricane because of that track that comes from the southwest, and the landfall location is just north of the opening to Tampa Bay. That maximizes the storm surge inside Tampa Bay and puts the metro area on the strongest side of the hurricane. Another track like that would be devastating today because we have so many more people and so much more infrastructure in harm's way, but nobody who's currently living in the Tampa Bay area has truly been through a major hurricane in the time that they've lived there.
Yeah, impressive.
Just haven't been through it. And so
same with Cape Cod, we'll get to that too.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the Northeast here a little bit. And Charlie and Ian were very unfortunate for the areas farther south, but all of these are wake-up calls that Tampa is vulnerable. Now let's go to the next slide and show you another area. This is close to my heart because I spent junior high and high school in the Houston area. I went through Hurricane Alicia in 1983 on the west side of town. My mom still lives there. Wow. And it is another metro area that has been dodging it over and over again for a long time. And as bad as Hurricane Alicia was, it was a borderline Category 3 when it made landfall on the coast. And even though it went in between my house out in Katy and downtown Houston, and there are a lot of damage to the glass skyscrapers and power outages and so forth, it was not a major hurricane strike really for the city of Houston. And Ike in 2008 was a large Category 2 when it made landfall. It was a big impact in Galveston, especially due to the storm surge. But again, not a huge impact for Houston. And when Laura was approaching in 2020, I don't know if you guys remember that forecast scenario, the models were very close to the Houston area, but stayed to the east, and the Hurricane Center stayed the course and did not have to unnecessarily shift the track or evacuate the Houston area. But Laura was a close call, just like Rita was in 2005. So
what did you do when Alicia was going by your house? What were you literally doing at that time, that day?
Well, it was in the middle of the night when the height of the storm happened. And it hasn't changed to this day that the houses in the Houston area do not have shutters, and most people don't have the plywood. And it was a loud, scary night. The howling sound was constant, and I wasn't even going through a major hurricane. And we did not have protection on the windows. And to this day, most people in the Houston area do not. And I hope that we don't wait until Houston gets its Andrew to change the building codes in Texas and in Houston and start doing in Texas what we do in Florida now and having hurricane shutters. But there's a huge vulnerability for the Houston metro.
This scared you more than anything, because I get some friends that want a major hurricane to come to their house, and I'm like, please.
Oh no! Last thing I want. No, I want nothing to do with them.
So as a meteorologist, you were an aspiring meteorologist, you were more frightened than in awe of the weather. Yeah. Yes,
and somewhat, people who become really good at fixing cars. A lot of times that is born out of a desire to be able to fix your own car. Now, I can't fix the atmosphere, but I do want to have something to say about where they're going and what we should be doing about them. But actually, 4 years prior to that, in 1979, I was in South Florida before we moved to Houston in the early 80s. And that's when I went through Hurricane David in '79, and it's threatened Southeast Florida. And I was watching Neil Frank, the director of Hurricane Center at the time, and I was scared then too. But that's when I decided. I told my parents I wanted to do his job someday, and I somehow got to do it.
Oh,
But here's the thing, though. In 1979, in our house in Florida, we put tape on the windows. That was before Hurricane Andrew. That was before the building
done
codes
that before.
changed.
I remember
before everybody got
ago.
shutters. Of course, we now we know a lot better than that. Tape on the windows does absolutely no good. In fact, it just makes the window's going to break just as easily, but the window will break into larger, deadlier shards. So don't tape your windows like we did 50 years ago.
Wow.
But people still do today.
That's
But
good
in Houston,
insight.
in Houston, people, you got to start buying shutters now because or buy plywood now if you're not going to install shutters, because one of these days, Houston Metro, that's a lot larger now than when I lived in it, is going to deal with a direct hit from a major hurricane. And look how fortunate Houston has gotten. Either you've been missed well to the east with the likes of Laura and Rita and Audrey in '57, which was a June major hurricane, by the way. But look at all these major hurricanes that passed off just to the south and the west, but not a direct hit on Houston. And Harvey does not count. Harvey was a major hurricane when it hit Rockport, Texas, well to the south. Harvey was a tropical storm in Houston and the flood disaster. So that was not a major hurricane. So I'm not saying Houston is overdue for an impact from a tropical cyclone, but they are overdue from the winds of a major hurricane. And I for my mom's sake and all my friends and family there, I hope it doesn't happen anytime soon, but I am really concerned that people aren't ready enough there. Not to mention the fact that most people in the Houston area still don't have flood insurance. A lot do, but still the majority don't. And that's another aspect that we're not ready for there. Well, let's go to the next one. We've got another metro area to talk about. And this is Fort Lauderdale. I'm headed around the coast toward the Northeast here. And now I grew up, before I was in Houston in junior high and high school, I was in South Florida. And I was there for the '70s. And we got practically nothing then. And since then, there have been some direct impacts, most notably in the '04 and '05 seasons. When I was at the Hurricane Center as a forecaster, Hurricane Katrina went right over the National Hurricane Center as a Category 1 hurricane. We looked out the little porthole window, we saw the flag go limp. The eye went right over us. But that was as a Category 1. And then that was 1 year after Hurricane Jeanne made landfall well to the north, 2 counties to the north of Miami in 2004. Hurricane Jeanne 2004, that was the hurricane that I had to take my very pregnant wife to the hospital for her to take shelter because she was going to give birth any day. Then I went to the Hurricane Center, slept the night before my forecast shift the next day. Hurricane Jeanne went by. Then we went home after the storm. Her water broke and my son was born right after Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Jeanne. So he waited till the hurricanes died down to be born almost 20 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is he going into meteorology? Life-saving?
No, he just finished his first year at Purdue as a computer engineering major.
Awesome.
So he's gonna do semiconductors and help us get our computer models for meteorology to run faster.
Oh, great.
So, and then Wilma 2005, that damaged my house in Broward County, Florida, but it was not a major hurricane for Southeast Florida. It was Cat 1 and 2, even though it was Cat 3 Southwest Florida. So there have been impacts in, for example, the Fort Lauderdale area, but nothing like what you'll see on the next slide.
Whoa. Oh.
So if the next 10 years are like the 1940s, I'm not sure how long it will take South Florida to recover from major hurricane after major hurricane. And it ended with Hurricane King in 1950. And that's the last time a major hurricane crossed the coastline or the metro area of Fort Lauderdale, Broward County.
That's amazing.
74 years ago. So we think we're all hurricane savvy in Fort Lauderdale, and we're not. We're not now post Andrew, we are more ready in general in Florida than prior to Andrew. The hurricane shutters are on most of the newer structures built after 1992. The building codes are among the best in the country. Older structures don't necessarily live up to those codes, but we have a lot of people who have never been through a major hurricane in Fort Lauderdale. And Miami, I think you could throw into this mix too, because for the most part, Andrew missed the core of Miami to the south. So this is another area where we need to do a lot more to get even more ready, especially from the wind, because I don't think there's enough wind sheltering in South Florida to handle the multi-million number of people. Not everybody's in a safe structure. Well, let's go to the next slide.
Just amazing. That can happen in a 10-year period. It happened before. It's going to happen again.
And so, so it's definitely not true that everything about hurricanes is getting worse. Okay? You go back in time, you can find some decades that were even worse for some particular areas.
Yeah, 50s, 30s, 40s, and 50s here in New England. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, this is the active era since 1995. Some of the East Coast major impacts that we've experienced without having a major hurricane landfall. So none of these were a Category 3 or stronger at landfall on the East Coast of the U.S. And they were still major impacts. So I'm definitely not saying that the East Coast has not been impacted, and that is absolutely not true. We've been impacted by water with Irene and with Sandy. We've been impacted by wind with Isaias recently. And with Dorian, we had people out on the eastern North Carolina that were told to evacuate, didn't or couldn't evacuate, and they had to, rescue teams had to come get them. Florence was bad in the Mid-Atlantic, mainly due to water. Ida made landfall in the Gulf, but we had a flooding disaster in the Northeast with its remnants. So we've had plenty of impacts, but none of them have been major landfalls. Now, go to the next slide, and these are the major hurricanes that have made landfall on the East Coast since 1995. Now, I threw everything in here that's a major hurricane at landfall from Key West upward. So we could debate whether or not Irma counts as an East Coast landfall, since that was, Cudjoe Key in the lower Florida Keys. Okay, if you don't count that one, then you got to go back to Gene of 2004, the last time a major hurricane made landfall anywhere from Florida mainland northward. And if you want to take Florida out of the mix, the only major hurricane to make landfall at Category 3 or stronger on the wind scale since 1995 north of Florida is Fran in 1996. So we've been dodging it recently with regard to direct hits from really strong wind events. And therefore, you would have a big storm surge event to go with that. So the East Coast has been spared at least the direct hit of a major hurricane. But again, as we just showed, we can have major impacts without a major hurricane Category 3 or stronger on the wind scale. Now we're going to compare recent history, the last 3 decades or so, and then we'll go back farther. Here are all the hurricanes since 1995 in the active era that have been, quote unquote, close to the Northeast. And what I counted as close to the Northeast is any hurricane that went north of 38 degrees north and west of 67 west. So relatively close to the Northeast. So this is the last 30 years. And if you think that's bad, go to the next slide.
Yeah.
This is the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Double the number of hurricanes going through that same zone. And as you mentioned, some major hurricane landfalls. So if we go back to these kinds of tracks with present day slightly stronger hurricanes, and hurricanes are also slightly slowing down near North America, and we've had a lot of large hurricanes. You got sea level rise. So once the tracks start taking hurricanes back to the Northeast, I think we're going to have a lot of impacts and more frequently than we've had in recent years. So all of this is just two motivations for sharing all of that with you. One is that not everything has been getting worse. Okay, and we've been catching some breaks with regard to really significant impacts in certain areas. Obviously, we've had some horrible impacts in other areas, but it's an alarm bell to get ourselves even more prepared than maybe we think we need to, because the breaks that we've been catching in some areas won't last forever. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now, let's talk a little bit about the hurricanes and storms themselves, about how they've been behaving, and are things changing, other than what I've already mentioned about hurricanes peaking out a little bit stronger than they used to, and maybe moving a little more slowly near North America, and sometimes being pretty large. Last year, again, with the record warm Atlantic waters that are now warmer this year than they were last year at this time, we had a Category 5 Hurricane Lee, which I think put to rest any question about whether or not the Atlantic could fight back against El Nino. And in a really strong El Nino year, to have a Cat 5 like Lee, I think that showed that the record warm Atlantic waters were still able to produce a big hurricane. Now, Lee was not the farthest south Cat 5 we've ever seen in the Atlantic Basin. That goes to Matthew 2016 there in the South Central Caribbean. It's not the easternmost Category 5 we've seen in the Atlantic Basin on record. That's Lorenzo 2019. But if you kind of draw a curved line from where Matthew was to the south and Lorenzo was to the east, Hurricane Lee last year, when it became Category 5, was about as far southeast as we've seen Category 5 hurricanes, along with the likes of Hugo and Maria. They're pretty far to the southeast. So, you wonder this year, how soon, how early in the game, how far south and east out in the deep tropical Atlantic and the main development region out there could something ramp up to a Category 5, because the waters are so warm out there.
Right.
So, in that sense, maybe things starting to push the boundaries, go a little farther outside of where we used to see them as compared to the past. Let's go next slide. And let's talk about preseason. Are things starting earlier than they used to? A lot of debate in recent years about whether or not the Atlantic hurricane season should start earlier than June 1. And a lot of that came out of a number of consecutive years. And look at all these years since 1995, especially in the last decade or so, several April and May tropical and subtropical storms, a lot of named storms, but no hurricanes. So that's a conundrum, isn't it? I mean, we've had a number of preseason named storms, but we haven't had any hurricanes. So what does that mean about hurricane season? Well, the National Hurricane Center took the approach of, well, why don't we just, on May 15th, when the East Pacific hurricane season starts, and we start issuing the routine 6-hourly tropical weather outlooks about the potential for development in the basin, why don't we just start sending those out in the Atlantic too, starting May 15th? Routinely every 6 hours. Now, that's not a huge change. They made that change a couple of years ago. Because what would happen before that is that they would issue special tropical weather outlooks in April or May if there was a potential for off-season development. So they have not made the change to the start of the hurricane season being June 1. And I think that's a good call, because most of these storms, most of them were subtropical at some point in their lifespan. So they're hybrid, not fully tropical. And you don't see anything down in the deep tropical Atlantic or the Caribbean, not in the main development region. Didn't have hurricanes. A lot of these are relatively weak, relatively short-lived. So I liken April and May especially to the football preseason, right? Yeah. It's not going to be, the activity is not going to be as intense as the real season. The stakes aren't as high, but somebody could still get hurt, right? And that's why they still have to issue advisories on tropical storms. Now, one caveat here is that if Beryl of 2012, you see there going into the southeastern U.S., that was in May of 2012, and Beryl was headed toward the Jacksonville, St. Augustine area, and it was strengthening, and it made it to a pretty strong tropical storm. If it had had another half day over water, it's possible it could have made it to hurricane. And that would probably be changing the conversation a little bit if we had had a landfalling hurricane in May. But as it stands, let's go to the next slide. This is the May Atlantic hurricane history. We have not had any hurricanes in May or April or March, for that matter. We've had January stuff out in the East Atlantic, but I think that's more tied to the end of the previous season, not really the beginning of a new one,
right,
meteorologically. And so we haven't had any hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin in 54 years. And the last one was Alma in 1970, and that was briefly in the Western Caribbean. We've only had 4 on record, and we've barely been grazed by one on the Outer Banks in North Carolina 116 years ago. So I don't think we have an increasing May hurricane problem. Right? It's just not been happening. But that doesn't mean it won't change in the future. But for now, I think a June 1 start to the hurricane season is a good start, because you don't want to start calling May part of hurricane season when we haven't had any May hurricanes. And then what's the public to make of that? Well, you're calling it hurricane season. We're still not having any hurricanes. But June is very different. June has a long history of producing hurricanes. Now, what about, are things going out of bounds in the East Pacific? What about California? We had Hillary last year. We've had other systems coming up to Southern California over the last several decades. And a number of tropical storms have gotten close or actually made it into California. And if you go back to the late 1800s, we had the San Diego hurricane. They had Category 1 hurricane conditions there. The Hurricane Center and the Weather Service have hurricane and tropical storm watch and warning breakpoints along Southern California coastline. So we know it's possible. And I think this is something to be cognizant of and preparing for, especially the water impacts from weakening systems. But yes, you can get a hurricane up to Southern California. It would just take a special set of circumstances, but the warming waters in general make that a little greater chance. And go to the next slide to just show you last year's systems. The west coast of Mexico got hammered by multiple hurricanes and tropical storms, including Otis and Acapulco, that rapid intensifier that was not well forecast. And then Hillary operational track took it as a tropical storm into California. But if you go to the next slide, in post-event analysis, it didn't quite make it as a tropical storm, but there was remnant moisture and a different low pressure system that formed. And it was impactful water-wise up in San Diego and especially inland areas. So we have to deal with the effects of tropical systems in Southern California, but it's rare. But could that change? And yes, we could get a hurricane into Southern California. And all of these ups and downs that we've seen in overall hurricane activity in the Atlantic Basin in recent years has largely been steered by El Nino, La Nina, capped off with the triple dip La Nina in 2020, 21, and 22. Now, last year in 2023, we went to an El Nino. But this is, El Nino and La Nina are one of the strongest modulators of major hurricane activity in the Atlantic. And you see, some of the, especially since 1995 in the active era, we still had in some of these neutral and El Nino years, below average numbers of major hurricanes. So you can still have a below average year, especially in El Nino years. But last year was a little different because we had the record warm Atlantic. So we had, an average number of major hurricanes, but we had Category 5 Lee. And with the departure of El Nino this year, we're going back to neutral or maybe La Nina. And so that's going to, unfortunately, make it highly likely that we're going to have an average to above average year this year. Now, a little bit about last year. Let's go to the next slide. Again, to have 3 major hurricanes and 7 hurricanes in an El Nino year, a strong El Nino year, that's remarkable. And that's a testament to the warm waters of the Atlantic being able to fuel that. But notice what was absent last year, especially if we go to the next slide and you see the entire season's activity. Look at the lack of hurricanes and major hurricanes in the Caribbean. Amazing. And that's one concern I have for this year with the departure of El Nino. That was one part of the basin where the effect of El Nino, I think, fought back against the Atlantic, as it often does. The wind shear and the sinking over the Caribbean. This year could be very different with the departure of El Nino, and we could have more hurricanes developing or coming through the Caribbean, and that puts more land areas at risk everywhere along the Caribbean island coastlines and along the Gulf Atlantic coast, including the Northeast. So there are reasons to be even more concerned this year than last year. However, we've had busy hurricane seasons like 1995, like 2010, where we've had a lot of storms and they largely missed the continental US. So there are no guarantees. But this year, I took this snapshot yesterday. The Atlantic is warming up and it is way warmer than average. And we've had more than a year and 3 months of the average Atlantic sea surface temperature being record warm. That's staggering. And we're even warmer now than we were last year. However, if you think, well, if the waters are so warm, where are all the hurricanes? If the waters are as warm as they typically are in July or getting into early August, where are the hurricanes? Well, obviously the water itself can't generate a hurricane. It's the ceiling weather disturbances. It's the wind shear in the atmosphere that still hasn't gotten to the point where we could generate storms and hurricanes yet, but that'll change. And this is one of the big reasons why we're so concerned this year about how busy it could be. But again, nobody knows how bad it will be because we don't know where the storms will go. Let's go to the next slide. So here's the seasonal forecast. So one thing that has gotten a lot of attention, and again, the big drivers here, why all the different entities are forecasting an above average year, because the departure of El Nino and the record warm Atlantic. That is it in a nutshell. There are a lot of details in there that dictate how an actual hurricane season turns out, and certainly how each storm behaves. But a lot of attention on the fact that NOAA has forecast the most storms on the high end they ever have, as many as 25. But that's not what gets my attention. In fact, in many ways, it might not matter at all if we have 17 or 21 or 25 named storms, because a lot of those will likely be relatively weak and short-lived and out in the middle of the ocean. Meaning you could have on the low end of the named storms 17 or 18 and still get up to 13 hurricanes and 7 majors. You take out those short-lived storms, like in 2020, we had 30 named storms, but a lot of those were weak and short-lived. It's really about, the storms that do make landfall. Even a tropical storm can be a disaster if it's slow-moving and or large. But the forecast ranges for the hurricanes, 8 to 13. We've never had any more than 15. 4 to 7 major hurricanes. We've never had more than 7 major hurricanes. So to go along with the record warm Atlantic sea surface temperatures, could we be approaching record territory for the numbers of hurricanes or major hurricanes? That's at least possible, given how warm the Atlantic is. Because it's a lot harder for the atmosphere to make a hurricane, and even harder for it to make a major hurricane. So the fact that there's such strong consensus and good reason to be forecasting a large number of hurricanes and majors, that's where the real skill in the seasonal forecasts lie. But again, these forecasts don't tell you where the storms and hurricanes are going to go, but there's good reason why the numbers are high. All right, let's go to the next slide. So given all of that, it's often difficult to message to the public about what do you do with the seasonal forecast. In fact, let's go back one slide just briefly, and just when we look at the seasonal forecast, it is important to realize that one thing the seasonal forecasts are really poor at, in addition to not telling you where the storms are going to go, the seasonal forecasts are really poor at encouraging us as a society to do what I think we need to be doing, which is to prepare the exact same way every year, regardless of what the seasonal forecast is. We should not be increasing our preparedness given a forecast like this and then decrease it when we see a forecast of average to below average hurricanes. Just look at 1983 with Alicia that I went through, 1992 with Andrew, other years where we've had a below average year and somebody got devastated. We do not want to be lessening our preparation just because the seasonal forecast is different. So that's one thing. That's one thing I don't like about the seasonal forecast is that it tends to cause us to ebb and flow with our preparedness, where we should be staying level. We should be unfazed by the seasonal forecast. However, in a year like this, a high forecast, it's a little easier to convince people that there's a little more motivation, a little more reason to get prepared. So instead of with the public, instead of talking too much about what the numbers are and how warm the Atlantic is and what El Nino's doing, we should be focusing the conversation and whatever attention that the seasonal forecasts are getting, and channel that attention and concern, if people have fear or whatever, into action. And there really are some things that people can and should be doing right now to get ready for that one hurricane that could come their way in any year. And these are the main pillars of what we call our hurricane strong mindset and set of things to do. And it starts with evacuation planning, knowing your evacuation zone and figuring out where you'd go and how you'd get there if you're told to evacuate. And then it's supplies, insurance, strengthening your home, plywood shutters, your garage door, et cetera, and then helping the vulnerable. And the goal is to do all of these things now and not wait till the hurricane's on our doorstep. Because I think one thing that people tend to do when they're concerned about hurricane season is, you just, I hope a hurricane doesn't hit me. But that's the wrong kind of hope. That's powerless hope. That's just wishing the problem away. Whereas if you take that approach and don't do anything to get yourself ready, then you're giving the hurricane all the advantage. And that hurricane you hope to never come, then it's on your doorstep. And then all the things you need to do to make yourself safe during the storm and afterward are a lot more difficult, more expensive, if not impossible to do at the last minute. So to have real hope that you can survive the storm and recover financially in the aftermath and all of that, that takes some action on our part so that we have the advantage over the hurricane. So let's talk about the first one, the evacuation zones. And this is an interesting question if you ask somebody, do you live in a hurricane evacuation zone? And a lot of people might be tempted to answer that question without even looking it up, because I think there's a little bit of a tendency among many people in the public that if they don't live on the beach, they don't have a storm surge problem and they don't have an evacuation issue. But as we like to say, just because you can't see the ocean from where you live doesn't mean the ocean can't come see you. And that can be blocks or miles inland from the coastline. And so I don't want people to fail to look into whether or not they live in an evacuation zone because they just assume they don't, when it might surprise them to find out that they do. And there are many examples around the country. Here's Tampa Bay as an example. You're nowhere near Clearwater Beach here, and you're inside the Tampa Bay area, and now you're near and even north of downtown Tampa itself. And look how far inland these evacuation zones go. And, bays, rivers, all kinds of, features that go inland from the immediate coastline can bring storm surge way inland. And in some parts of the country, many parts of the Northeast, for example, in and around Buzzards Bay, for example, and in Long Island Sound. And there's so many areas where, the storm surge can be captured. And Florida, this is just one example. Everybody should be going to their state's emergency management website or their city's emergency management website and find out if you live in an evacuation zone. And then if you do, then you got to figure out today where you go and how you get there if ever told to evacuate. And if you find out you don't live in an evacuation zone, then your homework assignment is to find a friend or family member who does live in an evacuation zone and work it out to be their inland evacuation destination. And a couple final thoughts on the evacuation question. If you live in a high rise and you're in a storm surge evacuation zone, you still need to plan to go, because you don't want to be on the 20th floor of a building without power in a community surrounded by water, and help can't come to you if anything happens to you. And if you're in a mobile home or a manufactured home or any structure that's unsafe from wind, you need to have a plan to evacuate. And even people who live not along the coast and they don't live in a storm surge evacuation zone, but live in an area that's prone to inland flooding, river flooding, you at least want to have a plan to get out if you're ever told to go. So a lot of us really need to be involved in planning. And again, you might ask yourself, well, why do I need to plan ahead of time? Can't I just look up my evacuation zone, plan evacuation if a hurricane's ever coming my way? Well, try doing all that at the last minute and you'll kind of get into a panic mode, and it'll be hard to figure out the best destination. What if you got pets? What if you got health issues? What if, where are you going to go? Who's going to take you in? Are there going to be shelters? Are there going to be hotel rooms? All that you really want to think about ahead of time. So that's piece number one, evacuation planning. That's where I urge people to start, because if you do live in an evacuation zone, that informs you, well, I'm vulnerable to storm surge. I could flood. I need flood insurance. Or you live inland, anybody can have flooding. If it can rain where you live, it can flood where you live. So after you figure out your evacuation zone and plan, the next thing to do is have an insurance checkup. We should all do this every year. And we're going to do a segment later this week on Weather Unfiltered here on the Weather Channel. We're going to talk to the Insurance Information Institute, and we're going to talk about all the possible ways that having an insurance checkup could save you money, either in the short term or in the long term. Because what we're trying to do, nobody wants to go have an insurance checkup. It's right there behind going to the dentist. It's our favorite things to do. But we're trying to prevent a weather disaster from becoming a financial disaster. And this is for renters and owners. You might have done things to your home that changes the value of your home. The value just might have gone up. You might be able to, because of your age or because of you have different policies, and bundle them together and get discounts. You might even be able to do things to your home, like put up shutters, like do some other improvements that will lessen your premium. So it could be a win-win. But bottom line, you want to be covered. You don't want to leave yourself without the ability to recover financially. And we urge people to, take pictures, have documents, and put them in a fireproof, waterproof case, because after disaster, you're going to really wish you had all those documents protected if you lose them.
Is it like it's in Florida, like in Massachusetts? I'm not sure if this is nationally, but there's a huge difference in the deductible in your home insurance, whether the storm is named or not, which I really don't get. Wind is wind. Is that the case in Florida also?
It varies from place to place, and it's one of those things you got to ask your agent about. It could even vary from policy to policy. So yeah, that is a specific question, and another reason to have that insurance checkup, to find out what is exactly covered and under what circumstances. Now, in most cases, renters and owners insurance policies don't cover flood. So that's the next issue to bring up with your insurance agent. And this is a true statement. If it can rain where you live, it can flood. Now, there are degrees, and you might have a pretty good idea that where you live is a lot less vulnerable to flood than other places. But there are very few places where it flat out can't flood. And a lot of flood disasters and people's financial disasters have occurred outside of areas where flood insurance is required, outside of the high risk zones. And I have started to say with gusto that when you have your insurance checkup every year, you should demand flood insurance. So why do I say that? Because a lot of insurance agents will tell you you don't need it. And I think that's bad advice. In most cases, that's bad advice. In fact, when I moved here to Atlanta, back here for the second time in 2017, and we got our home, went to the insurance agent, and I said, I want to get a flood insurance policy. And he goes, you don't need it. And I said, why? It's just because you don't live in a high risk zone. And I said, get it for me anyway. Because I'm not going to go through that risk. And if you're not in a high risk zone, the premiums are going to be lower anyway. Right. But again, it's a roll of the dice, but I don't want to put my family's future, at risk like that. Now, again, not everybody is in the same financial situation. Okay. And insurance is not dirt cheap, but when you compare the cost, you see at the bottom there, Annual premium is several $100s on average, but the average claim is in the tens of thousands.
Well, it's a lot more
Right.
expensive up here, and it's mandated on many of our coastlines that we get flood insurance, and costs keep going up and up and up. But people live in really vulnerable zones up here.
Yeah, they do. And you know, at the coast and inland, there are a lot of vulnerable places, inland along rivers and so forth. But the bottom line is to compare what would happen to your future without flood insurance. Like in the case of Hurricane Harvey, the average payout to people who had flood insurance was over $100,000, and it was a fraction of that to people who did not have flood insurance. You can't count on the government to bail you out completely. So it's a matter of protecting your financial future, if at all possible. And you know, again, a lot of people assume, a lot of people don't even realize that flood insurance is not covered automatically with your conventional renters and owners insurance. So that's the main reason to bring this up, is a lot of people don't even know that they have the need to consider separate policy for flood insurance, because they just assume it's covered with their standard policies, and in most cases that's not. So this is one topic we've hit on with some of our immersive mixed reality content on the Weather Channel. We're trying to make it compelling. And this next slide should be able to play the video to explain.
Category often gets the headline, but immense flooding from tropical systems, that's a real danger. I mean, think about this. I'm over 100 miles away from the coast. Got the winds that are light. I'm not even located in the cone, but it is already raining, and my flood risk is increasing. You know, the warming atmosphere is producing bigger rain events because of climate change. And possibly related, tropical systems, they've been moving slower, meaning longer duration of just heavy rainfall. So if you end up being evacuated from the coast, or let's say you already live well inland, it is very important to be aware of your flood risk. You don't have to be near big rivers either. I mean, small creeks and streams, these can become dangerous during flash floods. Even just ponding water around your home, oh man, that can be an expensive headache in a hurry. I mean, just 1 inch of water in your house, this can cause $25,000 worth of damage. So to help keep the water out, we need to determine where the water is collecting and flowing around our yards, to change the grading potentially and the landscaping to help improve that runoff. Also, you're going to want to routinely clean gutters. Make sure you use water-resistant building materials like pressure-treated wood, stainless steel hardware. And of course, if you live in a high flood risk area, please pay attention to the forecast and know if you need to evacuate ahead of an impending flood event.
That's pretty spiffy graphic.
Yeah, and that's all done in front of a multi-panel green screen, and we do a lot of that because we want people to be able to see and not just hear us talking about it. Well, let's go to the next slide.
Let's see, where are we?
Okay. Now for wind, this is under the hurricane strong pillar of protecting your home. And you know, I mentioned Houston before. There are a lot of other areas that people don't have their windows and doors, and especially their garage door, adequately protected. And we're really learning from the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes flash recently in this past year just how vulnerable our homes are because of the garage door, and with some relatively inexpensive reinforcements to keep that garage door stronger. Because if you lose the garage door, then there's a much greater chance you lose the roof and the contents and so forth. So you know, getting shutters or putting up plywood, reinforcing the garage doors could save all of us a lot of money and a lot of damage. And again, I mentioned earlier, do not tape your windows, as we like to say, go tapeless. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And then the other things to talk about when you go to your insurance agent are that you might have different types of policies, and if you bundle them together, that could lower the cost. And you do want to shop around. If you don't like the cost or the offerings from one company, shop around. You got to try to get the best deal you can, just like on any other major purchase. And it's also important when you're looking for a place to rent or buy, you try to find out how well built the structure actually is. And some areas of the country, some areas within a particular state have stronger building codes than other places. And one thing we've learned over the years is that people tend to assume that their homes are built to a very high standard or even exceeding that standard. In many cases, the building codes in our communities, depending on what state you're in, aren't as strong as we think they are. All right. So let's go to the next slide.
Okay, 10 seconds, jumpers, you ready? Oh, you might want to tug onto your parachutes one last time. We don't inspect them anymore. Could be a problem, I think. Okay.
You know what this feels like?
Like there's a category 5 hurricane coming.
And you're trapped somewhere with an outdated building code.
That is crazy.
Why would anyone take a leap of faith like that with their home?
Without a building code, you can't be confident your home will protect you in severe weather. No code, no confidence.
Check to see if your community has a strong building code at inspecttoprotect.org.
I'm just glad we didn't do that with a real place.
So you can actually go to that website and put in your address and find out what the building codes are in your area or in an area that you're considering renting or buying in. And that parachute analogy is really good. Can you imagine putting on a parachute, about to jump out of an airplane, and you just assume that the parachute was constructed properly or really strong? You wouldn't do it. But we tend to rent and buy our homes just by assuming that they're built to a high standard. And the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS, earlier this year put out their rate the states, and it varies tremendously from state to state, even within states, about how strong the building codes are. And there's a lot of battles between disaster safety advocates and some builders, and a lot of battles over how strong the building code should be. But as consumers, as people who live in the homes, we should be informed and demand stronger building codes. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Let's see.
And so I'm going to wrap it up with this. And these are just some big picture topics that have been coming up a lot. And the first one there has to do with the evacuation question that I brought up a few minutes ago. And as we saw with Ian, as we have seen in many other past big storm surge events, and this goes for just about all fatalities in tropical systems that tend to disproportionately involve the elderly and the vulnerable, health-wise especially. And in Ian, a lot of the fatalities were among people who couldn't get themselves out. Because when the evacuation instruction is given, we shouldn't just assume that everybody can get themselves out. Some people choose not to evacuate, and that's an evacuation compliance issue. But some people can't evacuate, and that's an evacuation assistance issue. And I had a grandmother who lived in Southwest Florida for many years. I would go get her out and take her to safety because she wasn't going to be able to do it herself. So we got to go get everybody out. And health issues can prevent people from being able to or being willing to evacuate. And so let's go get those folks. And there's a lot that can be done about that. As that video with the parachutes reminded us that strong building codes do work, including in Ian. I think the wind damage from the hurricane would have been a lot worse if the building codes in Florida weren't as strong as they are. We've got to keep reminding people to get insured for flood. A lot of people are having financial disaster from water because they don't know that they don't have that coverage for flood. And inland flooding, like in the likes of Florence, I think we're going to have to get to the point where we proactively get people out of places like Lumberton, North Carolina, or in the valleys of Vermont, or out of basement apartments in New York City that are very vulnerable to rain-induced flooding, and get people out before that actually happens. And there's a lot of people who die not due to the forces of the storm, but due to carbon monoxide poisoning or lack of power for medical equipment. And we have these indirect fatalities. So these are the big challenges going forward. And given how so many areas haven't been seriously impacted in a while, I think the sooner we get proactive about all these things, the better off we're going to be. So Tim, that's what I wanted to cover. And I've got a good 20 minutes here to take some questions.
Well, we really appreciate this, incredibly informative. And sometimes you don't think about half of what you just told us about. And even though we live in a vulnerable spot up here in southeastern New England for sure, and we're also in a case where we haven't had the experience. Most people that are graduating college right now have never even seen a hurricane here in Cape
Mhm.
Cod. We've had a lot of threats. That Lee looked kind of scary for a while there, but so far so good. So I'm going to go back through the chats here. And let's see. Let's see. Tamara says she was in the Houston uh, for Alicia, a house and Howard says had a house in the path of Gene, just lost a fence. Some neighbors lost their homes. Thank you,
Hmm.
Howard. Uh, Ronald, Ronald, it's truly staggering how many people don't have knowledge or understanding of this basic severe weather safety preparedness info. Have a generator, have a weather radio, right?
Yeah, interestingly, yesterday we had the state of South Carolina Emergency Management Director, Kim Stinson, on the Weather Channel, and told us that they did a survey and it's something like 30 or 40% of the people in their state did not know if they live in an evacuation zone or not. You know, so it's a matter of taking the time before there's a hurricane out there to figure all this out.
Let's see. Dr. Knabb, could you talk about how lucky East Coast of Florida, in particular Palm-Dade and Broward counties, have been? I think you did touch on that. Maybe that was before.
I did, and it's worth emphasizing, and it's staggering. And as an example, my dad has lived in South Florida, in the Fort Lauderdale area since 1973, and he's gone half a century without a major hurricane impact. And I think Irma really scared him when the southeast coast of Florida was threatened. But I do get this sense from him and others down there and other parts of the east coast of Florida, that there is a tendency to, well, it's not going to happen here. When you go nearly an entire lifetime living in some place and you don't have a major impact, and you think back to the likes of Wilma and Andrew in Fort Lauderdale and think those were your two major hurricanes, and neither one of them were even close to that in Fort Lauderdale. It's a challenge to convince people that it can't happen. It really, really is. And now parts of the east coast of Florida have had major hurricane impact. We talked about Gene in 2004, but despite the likes of Nicole and the effects of Ian and Matthew, we've had a lot of impacts, but I don't think people realize just how bad it could be in the east coast of Florida and in Tampa, for that matter. Florida is such a hurricane savvy state, right? And we've also been very lucky in many places. Fort Myers notwithstanding, of
we
course.
have Buzzards Bay and Narragansett Bay area, south side of Cape Cod. It's just so different. One should always prepare.
I was there. I was just going to mention, I walked the ground there after her when I covered the East Coast Awareness Tour, and I walked the ground there around the bays, and we looked with the emergency managers at all the storm surge that Hurricane Bob created, and a lot of structures weren't even in some of the places that the storm surge happened in Bob. So Bob is the last really big storm surge event in New England. That's a good reminder if you haven't looked into what Bob did. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, and I think that came through very fast at low tide. Let's see, my Rick, my 1860 house, 100 miles from the New Hampshire coast, survived spring 1936. That was a
wow
New England flood. OTOH, what's that mean? Vermont has shown the risks of stalled tropical storms. Oh, that's for sure. The flooding we've had in Vermont in the last 5 years, just amazing.
Just in the last year, how bad it has been, even without a hurricane. Yeah.
And December 18th, there was a winter storm.
Yeah.
That was amazing. The December 18th storm, I've never seen anything like that. I grew up in Bass River on Cape Cod, and we lost more banking this winter on the pond 10 miles inland from a storm surge coming all the way up Bass River with the southerly wind. And oh man, that was the worst. We gained some sand, though. The beauty of the Cape Cod National Seashore is you can't build hard armament. We just have to rebuild the stairs at Marconi Beach every winter. Now, it seems the erosion has been tremendous, but you keep a beach as long as you don't put a rock wall in front of it. Let's see. Please don't forget to mention NOAA SAME weather radio, which you can obtain from Skywarn store. Thank
Oh
you.
yeah, let's talk about the weather radios real quick. One supply, and I'm doing a hurricane supply segment here on the air in a couple hours, and I'm going to show what I have is a NOAA weather radio that also has regular radio and television band. Now, you might be thinking, no, that is so old school. You know, we have our cell phones now, we have the internet, we have all this stuff. But when the power goes out and comms go out, we're going back to old school. And NOAA weather radio and conventional radio and television audio broadcasts might be the first and only way you can get information during and shortly after the storm.
I was addicted to the weather radio when I was a little kid. I still have the same one from when I grew up, but I got to admit the batteries are gone in it, but I have it. Yeah, and they even make them now, like ones that have like flashlights on them and, you know, in part of this emergency kit. Let's see. What are the chances of a 1938 hurricane repeat in southern New England? You got to say it's not if, right?
Yeah.
It's not if.
Yeah, even though the forward speed of hurricanes near North America has generally been slowing down, that doesn't mean we can't have another express. You know, something that's in the Bahamas, and the next day here it is coming into New England really quickly.
Hurricane Bob didn't even exist, right?
Yeah.
3 days before it hit us. That was I was
91.
91. I was just starting my career. No, actually, it was the third year out of. I didn't have a job on television at that time. Oh, I did. I was in Providence, Rhode Island. I'm sorry. And our worst wind in Providence was on the backside with the northwest wind. Let's see. 1938 and 54 were both Cat 3 in New England. Yep.
And the early to mid 50s was multiple hits year after year in New England. So that was a really busy period. We go back to that. We're going to get really hurricane weary.
Yep. Our executive director here at the Blue Hill Observatory, Charlie Orloff, wrote a book about that. Carol, 1954, kind of changed his life on Cape Cod and in Connecticut. That was more 38, I guess. Let's see. I'm sorry. Question for Dr. Knabb. La Nina likely this summer. How, if at all, does that generally impact the placement of troughs and ridges? Is there a predominant steering pattern that develops as a result?
Well, I think we saw some evidence of El Nino last year with the troughing near the East Coast that tended to cause the likes of Lee to stay just off to the east. In many neutral and La Nina years, recently, some of these busy seasons, we've seen a lot of systems coming into or through the Caribbean and coming a lot closer to and directly impacting the East Coast of the U.S. So, every year is different. Again, you can have a neutral La Nina year and have a busy above average year and either have a lot of storms hitting the continental U.S. or none. So there is no silver bullet to say this is what the steering currents are going to be this year. But, the past tells us that a busy year can be bad for the continental U.S. It's not a guarantee, though.
Let's see. One must wonder what it was like in the 40s in South Florida.
Yeah.
I agree. My granddaughter was a police officer recovering bodies in a Quidnick. I'm not sure which storm that was. 38. I don't know. Great presentation. Thanks, Jeff Martin. Thank you for coming. Lydia, what is the wind speed that shuts down the bridges on the Cape? You should know that one.
Well, most bridges, around the country tend to they tend to not want people on those bridges once you get tropical storm force winds.
Right. Tropical
and
storm
so,
warning.
Yeah, and that means that transportation might need to stop. Evacuations might need to be concluded before tropical storm force winds arrive. And that's why the hurricane and tropical storm and storm surge watches and warnings are tied to the time of arrival of winds of tropical storm force.
I was kind of not forced. Well, it was for a job, but I had to leave Cape Cod during Edouard in September 1996. And I was supposed to be at the TV station, and by the time I was supposed to be on the air, I had gone from Harwich to the Sagamore Bridge, and I think it was my first ever cell phone. I did a cell phone interview, and how backed up Cape Cod was. It was almost impossible to get off at that point with Edward. Hopefully, they were going to be smarter and faster. Sometimes they turn the bridges so it's just off. What influences, let's see, sorry. What influences long-term hurricane tracks? Florida and the rest of the East Coast seem periodically see groups of strong hurricanes during certain periods and decades without big wind events.
Yeah, and it's hard to take that history that we know and predict how the steering currents are going to change in the future. But one thing that we've noticed, and this goes back to the issue of storms going a little more slowly than they used to, is a lot of high latitude, high pressure ridging that is blocking or slowing down the northward progress of hurricanes, not keeping them from going north, just they get there a little more slowly and then they stop. And so some recent examples would be Harvey and Sandy, where Harvey got to Texas, Sandy got to the Northeast, and they slowed down, turned left, and essentially stalled for a little while. Instead of coming barreling into the Texas coast, instead of going express up the East Coast,
right,
that high latitude ridging is slowing them down a
and
little bit.
They turned cold core, and that kept the rain going.
Mm-hmm.
If it becomes active later in the season, would the upwelling effect suppress storms that develop subsequently, or is that just localized, short-lived phenomenon?
It's relatively localized and short-lived. In fact, last year, you had major Hurricane Franklin, and then later on you had Lee. The cold wake of Franklin is something that Lee went over the edges of. So it's a relatively limited area, and eventually the ocean recovered. So sometimes it is an effect. If one hurricane goes over the cold wake of a large, slow-moving, intense hurricane, it can affect the intensity of a subsequent hurricane, but it's not likely to last for a long time and affect a large area.
Thanks, Doug, for that question. Frank, thank you, Dr. Knabb and Tim. Very informative webinar. I remember Hurricane Gloria in 1985 and Hurricane Bob 1991. And so do I. Yeah, that were just sort of appetizers for something perhaps worse, although Bob was pretty
that's a good way to put it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Peter, are our chances this year higher for a New England strike due to the forecasted number of storms that will be out there? And can Boston experience a Category 3 or higher?
Take the last one first. Can Boston experience a Category 3 or higher? Absolutely. It's within the realm of possibility. It's happened before. We showed that map of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We had multiple major hurricanes affecting the Northeast and New England. And with regard to the chances, one example to point to is that Colorado State University, Phil Klotzbach puts out landfall probabilities for stretches of coastline. And for the entire continental U.S., never mind how you splice it up by region or state, everybody's chances are higher this year. Not a guarantee, but compared to average, our chances are higher this year in any one spot.
And some people have been asking what's CSU, Colorado State University. So if you just put in CSU hurricane forecast, you can see the seasonal updates. Oh boy, we've got a lot of messages here. Let's see. Rick, Hurricane Lee was similar 38, just too far east and got to Nova Scotia. Yeah.
But it was huge. Lee was absolutely huge. So that's why it still had its tentacles in the Northeast, even though the center was way off to the east.
Luz, does the Weather Channel have any lives on social media when there's a declared weather emergency? Local media gives the public mixed info and would be great to Weather Channel directly on social platforms. Absolutely. I've seen it in action. Justin Mike, Jim Cantori.
We'll have people covering things live from the threatened areas, and you can also stream our network anytime on streamtwc.com, but also we tend to open it up to even wider audiences when there's a hurricane threat. Right.
Let's see, Cheryl, there's a lot to discuss in the current large and very warm eddy in Florida that influences the strength of hurricanes, ? If I have it right. Is that right?
The sea surface temperatures around Florida are epically warm, and that's part of the reason why we already had in May some record heat index values in Key West and Miami, and it's part of the whole pattern that is leading to weaker trade winds across the tropical Atlantic Caribbean and into Florida, and those weaker trade winds lessen the amount of overturning and upwelling in the ocean, and then contributes to the waters getting even warmer. And the waters in the Gulf, in the Caribbean, and the tropical Atlantic, much of the Atlantic, are way warmer than average because of that pattern, including Florida.
Blair says, hi, Blair. What's the likelihood of New York City? She lives in New York City and Mid-Atlantic, Northeast seeing another storm similar to Sandy in the next few years.
Well, every storm is different. And so, are we going to get another Andrew? Are we going to get another Harvey? Are we going to get another Sandy? Are we going to get another Bob or Long Island Express? Maybe shades of one or more of those, but the next storms could have their own idiosyncrasies that could make it the first hurricane you can ever remember behaving like that where you live.
Yeah, I like to say that a lot is once in a lifetime weather seems to happen to someone somewhere on the planet almost every day because of the variety of just everything. And
but could we see the likes of those past storms again this year? It's possible. Yeah.
Possible, right? It's impossible. So I think that your message is the best. Be prepared that you are going to get hit by a Category 3 hurricane this season, and if you don't, then you're not that much better off for the practice. And you got me thinking. I don't even have a generator. I had a generator once, and it failed the time I needed it because I didn't take care of it properly. That was a major mistake, and you can see
a couple
not that far away.
And with generators, of course, we always have to urge people, because we've lost a lot of lives with improper generator use, with people getting the carbon monoxide poisoning. But also now the battery technology has gotten to the point where you can have a pretty decent power backup in your house, not necessarily for everything, but with a battery kind of generator, if you just want to have a more limited capacity.
And I guess for those of us thinking about rebuilding, we probably want to get that out of the first floor now, right? Especially if you live near the ocean. They're changing those codes finally. Yeah, I've got houses going up on stilts right down the road here. Let's see.
Absolutely.
Just about done. Peter, thanks, TK and Dr. Knabb. Very informative. Ben, thank you. Lydia, fabulous presentation. Thank you, Lydia, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Rick Knabb. You're on television in 1 hour, huh?
Yep. It's time to go get wired up, made up, and ready to rock. So
the people always used to say, who does your makeup? And I said, I do my makeup. Who does your makeup?
Yeah, I do my own. It's pretty simple. Alex Wilson has to go through a little more effort than I do.
I would go into the makeup room, which we finally had, and the ladies would have to be in there for about an hour, and I'm like, doot, done, see out there.
I just have to make sure I'm not getting real shiny on the forehead and all that. But before I started television, that was one of my big concerns. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to wear makeup. I don't know if I can do that. It's one of the it's a non-issue. It's the least of my problems.
I know NBC sent the consultants around. I think the NBC on the Weather Channel there for a while, and they taught you how to do makeup. I was taught how to do makeup 25 times, and I kept going back to just a little powder. Well, anyhow, we really appreciate that. Blue Hill.
Thanks for having me.
Is very grateful, and if you're ever in town, you get the personal tour. We just built a new. It's called the Science Hall for Scientific Discovery, named after Mish Michaels, and I know that she worked down the channel with you and Jim for a while, so she's very close to our heart up here, and would be happy to host you in person if you ever get the chance to come this way, and hopefully for nice weather.
I appreciate that.
All right,
I would look forward to doing that. Thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody for participating.
Welcome. Thank you. All right, thanks everyone for coming. We do this again in a quarter or so. Okay, and it'll be online at bluehill.org. Great.
Thanks.
All right, see ya. Thank you, Cheryl, for hosting and putting this all together. Oh,
Tim, you put it together. You and Charlie, thank you for a fantastic program. It was really great. We appreciate you most of all. And of course, Dr. Knabb and his expertise. We're counting on you guys to get us through the season.
And
The season
shirts.
has
You
arrived.
get the shirts. Come to actually this if anyone's still there this weekend, we're hosting Blue Hills is part of sponsoring a surf competition right over here in Hull at Nantasket Beach in Massachusetts. If you're in the neighborhood, come on down. Don McCaslin's coming, so there may be kites, and we're gonna have some shirts too with the Blue Hill and the surf logo. So that's a new thing. So we're trying to spread our tentacles too. All right, Cheryl, great to see you recently, and I guess we'll see you again. We're going to have this big event, fundraiser, educational fundraiser at Trillium on Wednesday, July 31st.
First.
More on that to come in your email inbox, and we'll be there. I think Matt Noyce and maybe Danielle will be there too, among other people.
For those who are still here, we will send a recording of this to everyone who attended and those who couldn't make it. So you'll have your own recording to go back over.
Great. All right. Thanks, Cheryl.
Bye, Tim. Have a
All
fabulous
right.
day.
Bye, everybody.
Signing off.
Signing off.